on. We've got bigger fish to fry here. We have an election next year. We've got to figure a way to get out of this. And one of the suggestions is to begin the process of blaming the failure of the proxy war on the Ukrainians that have been fighting it. I think we've already seen that happen in the New York Times, the Washington Post, where you'll read these lines in Time magazine that says, well, you know, we've given Ukrainians everything they wanted. We've given them everything they've asked for, and they still can't seem to make it work. It's the kind of thing that I remember listening to people say about Vietnam towards the end. In 1969, 70, 71, I said, look, we've done everything. We've given them everything, and, it's time for us to get out. In other words, whatever had nothing to do with us. When in reality, of course, the opposite is true. We created this proxy war. We installed this government in Kiev in 2014. We drove them forward. We promised them the world. Biden and Boris Johnson both promised Zelensky, we'll give you everything. You'll have the entire scientific industrial power of the United States and NATO behind you. The Russians have no chance because all of the underlying assumptions were wrong. And they were wrong because people said, well, Russia is just this gas station with nuclear weapons, that there's nothing to it, that the Russians are weak. And then we began lying to everybody, telling them that, well, the Russians are stupid, they're incompetent, and so forth and so on. So here we sit a year and a half later. Ukraine is destroyed. It's down to perhaps 19 or 20 million in population. At least 14 million have left the country. We think now somewhere between 350 and 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. I saw some overhead imagery recently that suggested that 123,000 freshly dug graves are waiting to receive dead Ukrainian soldiers, even now as we speak. This is a catastrophe. It's a disaster. It needs to end. But to end it, if you're not going to tell the truth, and I don't see much evidence that anyone in Washington will, the answer is, well, it's not our fault. It's someone else's fault. And everyone hopes that they can simply place the blame on the Ukrainians and quietly over time turn everybody's attention to the new great threat, that being, of course, China. And so I see more and more emphasis on China. I see an effort to de-emphasize Ukraine and to blame things on the Ukrainians.
People may be just shocked because what you're saying is so different from what they'll read in the New York Times and see on cable news, and it doesn't matter whether their favorite channel is conservative or liberal, because on this issue they're very much in lockstep. But the conventional wisdom, the narrative that's spun on the mainstream media outlets is, well, wait a minute, Vladimir Putin invaded his neighbor. Forced him to invade his neighbor. He invaded a sovereign country. Why is that rationale flawed? You can understand why people who hear you talking about the United States' role in bringing this conflict to fruition might bristle at that a little bit. Why is the conventional narrative incorrect?
Well, first of all, we could spend hours explaining why it's fundamentally false. Let's talk a little bit about why this false narrative suggesting that all of this is simply because Vladimir Putin woke up and dreamed of reconquering Eastern Europe and decided to march into Ukraine. First of all, we have the hangover from the Cold War. People listened for decades. The bottom line is that I think we're dealing with the hangover from the Cold War, obviously. People are used to hearing terrible things about the Soviet Union. People haven't made in the United States the adjustment to a Russia that is not communist, a Russia that is not bent on expansion, a Russia that is not incurably hostile to the West. That's part of the problem. The second part of the problem is that, people are still willing to believe the mainstream media. One would think after the Russia hoax with Donald Trump and this entire clown show in Washington that have tried desperately to depict him in such unfavorable terms that at least half the population would have long since walked away from the mainstream media. So that's part of the problem. But the thing to keep in mind is that Ukraine was picked by us some time ago as a place that we wanted to expand NATO. The promise was made early on to Gorbachev that we would not take advantage of the withdrawal of Soviet forces from the region. We would not expand eastward beyond Germany. Obviously, all of that was thrown under the bus under Bill Clinton. And then we began this actively hostile policy towards Russia. And we sent some of the worst people you could begin to imagine over to Russia to advise them on what they should do with their economy. It was so appalling that Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, backed off and said, this is a catastrophe. We're trying to force Russia down this road to pure capitalism. It can't do it. This is going to have terrible consequences. All of this came together. Putin picks Russia up out of the gutter, recovers it from the ruins, and tries desperately to convey to us the fear in Russia of having NATO immediately on its border, particularly given what they saw happen to Serbia in the Balkans, what they saw happen in Georgia. And that's one of the reasons why when the coup occurred and we installed this radical nationalist government with the help of the CIA in Kiev, that people in Russia said, we've got to act immediately. And they went and seized Crimea, which historically was Russian anyway, where the population was Russian and disliked the Ukrainians intensely. So they went into Crimea because they saw that becoming almost immediately a naval base for the United States Navy. So here we sit after all this nonsense. 14,000 people were killed between the outbreak of the coup in 2014 and today, or actually in January of 2022, because the Ukrainians immediately began attacking the Russian people that lived on the eastern side of Ukraine and treating the Russians as third-class human beings, brutalizing them, mistreating them. And, of course, none of that got any attention in the press. Russians were bad. Ukrainians were good. It's this black and white treatment of everything. You know, it's not surprising, but I think Americans have said, no, wait a minute. You said that we were going to win, that the Ukrainians were going to win. Then you told us they were winning and they were winning and they were winning. Becoming increasingly obvious that after $180 billion worth of aid and cash, Ukraine is a catastrophe. Yeah. Everybody's leaving. The place is falling apart. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. Well, this was a bad idea, and the American people have the incentive to step in and say, stop. And, of course, that's a very intelligent thing, but again, the donors won't quit.
You alluded to NATO a couple of times, and obviously you're no stranger to dealing with NATO. You have a lengthy history in public service working with NATO. You were or at least one of the top planners of the 1999 NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. You've dealt with NATO leadership. You've dealt with the leadership and the military of other NATO countries. One of the things that's come about as a result of this Russia-Ukraine war is that NATO has expanded even more. Finland officially joined NATO back in April. It's looking now like Sweden is going to be joining the alliance, abandoning historical neutrality. Explain to Americans listening what that means in terms of where that leaves American security. Explain to folks where that leaves us. A lot of people might think, all right, the bigger NATO is, the better, the more safe that makes America, the more we're able to provide for everybody's common defense. Is that the case?
No, actually, it's the opposite. The sad truth of the matter is that most of the countries are quite small. I mean, you look at Finland, there are, 5 million Finns. Sweden has got perhaps 8 million people. These countries are not adding to the scientific industrial power of the United States. They are not adding to American security. They're effectively joining an organization that already consists of military dependencies. Germany was the one state that at one point actually fielded large and powerful forces, but then systematically disarmed itself, leaving essentially the United States almost alone. The only other state with a sizable and powerful military, of course, is Turkey. And most people regard Turkey as at most a paper ally. So, no, we're not more secure from this. What we've done is we've created an enormous problem for ourselves in terms of trying to secure everybody and their future. So that's one problem. Second thing is when Eisenhower was president in the 1950s, he encouraged neutrality. He was very happy when Austria became neutral and hoped that most of Eastern Europe could be neutralized because he said we can't possibly defend all of these countries. Well, that was in the 1950s when we were probably stronger as a nation in terms of social cohesion, scientific industrial power, finance, military, everything than we are today. Much, much stronger. Today, we are actually at a weak point. And this is the wrong time for us to expand our obligations. I mean, there's an old expression, covenants without swords, what the British used to talk about in the 1920s and 30s. The British Empire took on more and more responsibilities, including the defense of Poland in 1939, which it absolutely could not provide. And yet they did it. They expanded their obligations, but they didn't have the forces to back it up. That's our problem at this stage of the game. And meanwhile, the Russian military is now stronger and larger than at any time since the 1980s, with modern equipment and excellent soldiers who are actually very well trained and very well led.